Hello everyone. Just before I get going, just want to say a quick thank you to Peter and the team at Innovise for organising such a fantastic conference over the couple of days. I know how hard you guys have worked on it, but as someone who's been attending, I'd just like to say how good it's been. So hopefully I can live up to the high standards that the rest of the speakers have set already. So I'm not going to tell you too much about me. We'll do that later if anyone wants to find out. Just going to get straight on with what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm really here to tell you about something I'm really passionate about, and that's green infrastructure. And in particular, quite a cool project I've got going on in Devon at the moment. Is it going to work? No, it's on the button, is it? We got the laser still? Laser works, okay. So, Sidmouth, for those of you who don't know, it's a beautiful coastal town situated on the south coast of East Devon. It's a long history of flooding from all sources, primarily surface water, fluvial and coastal. Some of the pictures that you can see there, this was a surface water event back in the 60s. This one down here is a fairly regular occurrence. This is across a ford. You can see a floodgate in the background. That's the River Sid. That's regularly inspecting. There's some really cool YouTube clips of it passing through a park. And then this one is some of the battering that the coast gets. So it really is under pressure from coastal flooding and other sources. This presentation is going to focus on the Phase 2 surface water flood alleviation scheme. It's going to explain the need for the project, the solution and site-specific challenges, and describe the hydraulic model built to represent the solution, along with some of the challenges faced along the way. Obviously, that's going to touch on microdrainage. Okay, it's a bit slow this, it's my fault, transitions. Okay, so the need for the project. So Jacobs were commissioned by Devon County Council in 2013 to produce a county-wide surface water management plan. This surface water management plan identified Sidmouth as being at a high risk of surface water flooding. Within 12 months, unfortunately, Sidmouth then experienced the flood event, which flooded 18 properties. Following that, a surface water management plan was then commissioned for the town itself, which showed that in a 1% AEP or 100-year event, we had 86 residential properties at risk of flooding and 68 non-residential properties. Okay, so the solution. So the modelling for Sidmouth showed overland flow paths which converge on the town centre, which was, actually let's hop back a slide there, just show that. So it's quite an important point. We've got Station Road that comes down from the top, and then All Saints Road, and the flows split at that point, heading partially down that route and partially along this route, before converging on the low point here. A little bit slow, this. So for those of you unfamiliar with the term cross-drain, which is up on the screen there, it refers to large inlet capacity linear drainage channels running perpendicular to the highway from one side of the curb to the other, the aim of which is to cut off all overland flows so that no bypassing can occur, which is what typically happens with most road drainage. The initial outline business case for funding set out that the flows need to be captured along Station Road, which is this road here. It's on the previous slide. And the initial idea was to locate that capture at that point. The flows would then be stored in a tank beneath the existing car park before overflowing to a storage area in the knoll itself, which is this parkland here. So whilst an optimised solution was possible for capturing the exceedance flows, using the cross drains that we've already mentioned, storage beneath the car park had to be reconsidered due to it being identified for redevelopment in the near future, and so an alternative solution needed to be developed. So the new proposal adjusted the position of the cross drains 50 metres further south. I should have zoomed out a bit more on this, but the original position was roughly up here. and we shifted that down here. That was primarily due to the fact that there was some steep walls or steep sides to the edge of the carriageway there without any footways, which nicely confined the flows. And then the flows from that point were then going to be passed into the swale, which we can see that runs down through the parkland, with the flood storage area located towards the bottom. Just to give you a feel for scale, that swale's about 130 metres long. So the knoll, some pretty cool photos there. The knoll's been used as a venue for the Sidmouth Folk Festival since 1955, and the concrete slab that these guys are having some fun dancing on here is actually what you can see here. And the site is a natural amphitheatre. You can see how the slope rises steeply away from this venue, and that's pretty much how people came and watched those folk festivals over the years. And so the idea of creating a dual-use space for flood storage and performance was born. So I can't take all the credit for this. My landscape architect colleague, Chris Wilkinson, had some initial inspiration for how we might achieve this. He took some ideas from a National Trust property called Claremont Park. For those of you who live towards London, you might recognise that. It's in Esher. At Claremont Park, the landscape gardener, Charles Bridgman, created a turf amphitheatre, as you can see on the screen there. It was pretty innovative for the day. He did this in 1715, so great to take some inspiration and move it forwards to today. So whilst that idea transferred really well to the knoll, the use of some subsurface storage was retained, and that was to ensure that the surface storage would only function in the more extreme events, so that they could be used during those more extreme events for concerts. Obviously, when it's having flooding, if it was going to be always on the surface, then it would take that out of action as a functional concert venue. So thought then had to be given to how water on the surface would pass into that subsurface storage beneath. Ugly, shall we say, traditional inlet structures would be a hazard to people using the venue. So a solution that majored more on infiltration was focused upon. I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So the solution that we looked at basically was a spiral-shaped filter drain. Where can we go? You can see it swirling around. That was one of my ideas. Quite challenging to achieve, though. So a spiral-shaped filter drain representing a vortex to transfer the flows from the surface to a drainage blanket beneath. And then from that drainage blanket, it would then pass into a geocellular crate system beneath before discharging to a central chamber, which is a throttled chamber with a hydro brake in there. And then passing back into the sewer system on Station Road. Well, we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute, but now I'm going to show you a couple of videos. This first video, do I need to press play here? Let's just see. It worked before, didn't it, Peter? Yeah, I'm on the wrong screen. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So what we're doing now, this is a visualization that was created using the same software that any gamers in the room. This has been creating 3D Studio Max, which is the same bit of software that Fortnite was produced in. My son was very excited when I told him that I'd been using something that produced Fortnite, but he actually was quite impressed with this, but he half expected some characters to be running through shooting people. So what we're seeing there is we're flying around the site, having a bit of a look. We're coming from the south and then working our way along the swale and up towards the head wall. One of the reasons why this was produced was to try and get across how this is actually going to look. So as engineers, we're so used to producing drawings to try and represent our designs, but this was a really key part to convincing the landowner and other key stakeholders that actually this was going to be a great thing, not just from a flood management perspective, but also from a place to go and a venue for many different things other than just managing that water. I'm just going to hop it on a bit there. So let's see whether we can go on to the next one. Happy days. Okay, so this is now showing you, when I press play, what will happen as the water flows up. So the water is rising in the swale there. This isn't an exact hydraulic representation, just a bit diagrammatic, to give a feel for how it's going to look as the water starts to fill. The water's building up, and then this is the bit that I actually like the most. A few arrows to help everybody understand what's going on. You can see it flowing through the parkland between the trees, and then making its way. Now this next bit clearly isn't exactly what's going to happen. I think the guy got a bit carried away with that. But you get the general idea. Okay, so as this next section says, this project has thrown up quite a number of challenges. And I can't say I haven't got some grey hairs over a few of them coming up at the last minute. This first one, though, all the trees in the knoll are protected by a tree preservation order. So for those of you who know all about that, you'll understand what I'm going to say next. Each tree's been then classified in terms of its importance, and root protection areas have been then assigned based on the class, the species, etc. So the design has been really heavily influenced by the tree roots. But that said, we've still had to work our way around that as best we can, but unfortunately we've had in a couple of cases to remove a couple of trees, but had to mitigate that by planting some additional ones. So another one of the challenges we've had, we heard earlier on, and I think yesterday as well, sort of the issues with groundwater and infiltration. This site has actually got pretty poor infiltration. It's not the worst, you know, it still would achieve some kind of outflow, but it's not ideal. So it's kind of ruled out the option of soaking all the flows away. The high groundwater issue, we were very good in terms of commissioning proper monitoring and installation of boreholes at this site. And for the best part of a year, it looked like we kind of wasted our money because the groundwater was so low that it was no problem and it was great. But then in November last year, we had a very uncomfortable remote borehole monitoring reading come in that basically said that the groundwater was in the tank. So we immediately went, what are we going to do about that? So we had to think about that, and we had a hydrogeologist build a conceptual model of what that would mean for our tank, because the upshot of high groundwater in a tank means you line it. But in this context, what we actually found out is the inflow was so the inflow was so low that the flow out of the tank could manage it. So we actually left it unlined, or are leaving it unlined, so water can enter it, but it then still leaves. So we've had to gain permission from the people who are receiving the water that they're okay with this, but it is less than 2 litres a second that we're talking about here. So it's a pretty small amount. So other challenges, this is a cross drain looking across the carriageway. This is at the top end of the site. What you can see there flowing from right to left is the cross drain in situ. These things are great at capturing the flows, but obviously because they're in that top sort of 500-600 mil, it's quite often stock full of services, as we can see here with the little clouds. We've got gas over here, we've got sewer here, we've got other sewers and water supply over there. So what this clearly demonstrates is where you're going to try and implement this kind of solution, you have to think about early discussions with those utilities to try and ensure that those things can be moved, and obviously you build those costs in because you don't want any nasty surprises later. So building the model onto the micro drainage bit. The model for the surface water management plan covering the whole town was built using InfoWorks. It was decided that due to the complexity of the town scale InfoWorks model that the design for the SuDS in the knoll would be better done as a separate model. After careful consideration and other things like available resources, on balance we felt that actually microdrainage was going to do the best tool for the job here. So we developed our SuDS model using microdrainage, but then verified the impact on the rest. I'll have to speed up now. Verified its impact on the rest of the town by feeding the flows back out of that at the throttle back rate. The InfoWorks model had identified that the 100-year critical storm was the summer 180-minute duration, This storm produced an inflow to the knoll of 275 litres a second. It's not as big as some of the flows that some other people have mentioned here today, but it's certainly a lot flowing down the highway. A hydrograph for the critical storm flows at the location was then taken from the InfoWorks model and inputted to the microdrainage model. In addition to that, as well as that as an inflow, we also allowed for the greenfield runoff from the parkland itself and the swale, and also the groundwater inflows as a base flow within the model. So I'm just going to briefly talk about two different parts of what we did. We started off doing a 1D model, and then we went on to a 2D model. I'll explain a little bit more on that in a second, if I've got time. The 1D model originally included, as you can see on the screen there, a swale with multiple check dams. The pink things are the multiple check dams. Then a surface pond feature to represent surface storage, subsurface geocellular crate, and the flow control chamber. For those of you eagle-eyed in the room, you'll spot that all of the check dams are now missing in the 2D model. I'll explain why in a moment. A 3D ground model of the parkland was in the 2D model, including the proposed amphitheatre design to bring that sort of realistic feel. The swale with 2 check dams, like we just mentioned, and again the subsurface crate system and the flow control, which was constant throughout. So some of you in the room might recognise this next diagram. So in order to determine the effect of a variety of storms and flow depths, sensitivity checks were run using suitable Manning's N values to reflect the differing grass conditions. The graphic shows a figure extracted from the SuDS manual, which details the effect of flow depth on roughness coefficient in grass swales. As the flow depth increases, so the roughness coefficient drops as the grass is laid flat. It's important to understand this element due to the impact upon velocities and thus erosion. The check dams along the swale were spaced based upon the guidance in the SuD manual originally, which is the 1D model that I showed first. But after several runs of the model, it was clear that the storage being provided was pretty insignificant, actually, in terms of the overall thing we were trying to achieve. But they were actually having some velocity issues, or causing some velocity issues. So as part of the model development, the check dams were then removed, with the exception of the flow, the check dam at the top end of the swale, and just immediately upstream of the amphitheatre itself. That was primarily to control sediment, so to protect those areas from sediment. Okay, so the horizontal, so we talked about there's a central chamber, which is the flow control, as well as the spiral filter drain that we had going on to allow for that passage of water through. We allowed for, it's not going to be an ugly chamber, but we don't actually have the design for this yet, but in effect it's an orifice, but it's laid flat. So that's how we've gone about modelling it. So we've gone effectively, when you've got 0 depth, that's when it's functioning as roughly a 150mm diameter would do on its side. So that's how we've done that, and that's included as a depth flow relationship in the model. So this is the rationale then between the 2D versus 1D. In the 1D model, the model flows from the swale enter a chamber, which is sized to represent the subsurface tank and the overlying amphitheatre. Flow backs up in this chamber due to a vortex flow control. The outputs from this model negate the effect of the filter drain or on slowing the flows, entering the subsurface tank. But it was felt that the outputs overall were kind of like a conservative view. So it was good enough for early design, but we didn't feel that it reflected maybe what would be going on the surface. So the 2D model, the flows leave the swale and enters a shallow conduit, which is what we can see here. Yeah, the spiral filter drain is a shallow conduit. That's representing the filter drain, the voids in the filter drain, as opposed to the actual full cross-section of that. When the flows get to a certain depth within that, they are then looped to the central flow control chamber. And the flow within that filter drain is done as a flow depth relationship. Am I nearly up, or am I out of time? Okay, I'll try and speed up a bit, sorry. Okay, so just onto a few little bits. I think there's a nice little video here. You can see the end because it's showing you already. The teething issues, we had some teething issues with the 2D model. So there's some spurious gaps, as you can see here. They materialized from somewhere. I'm not really sure why. We're still working on that. But it's something that can get resolved by rerunning the model. Flow volumes varying between the 1D and 2D outputs, which wasn't entirely surprising, but again, it's something else that we're still looking into at the moment. But like I said, we felt pretty confident with the 1D model and the outputs of that, so we're still progressing with things on that basis, but we are working to resolve this. I've just got a little video, hopefully. Just click on that, just to give you a bit of a feel for the flow into it. It's on 4 times speed, so it will get to the end fairly quick. It was just to reduce the file size of the video, actually. So that's nearly it from me, but I'm just going to sum up with a few final thoughts, if I can find them. Okay, so whilst we've had many challenges on this project, it's actually been one of the most interesting projects of my career so far. It's not a particularly big job, but it will actually have a really positive impact on the town of Sidmouth. And as I live in Exeter, which is about 10 miles-ish from Sidmouth, it's somewhere that I actually spend quite a bit of time with my family, so we're quite invested in the town itself, and it would be great to see a new concert venue for the town and something that's also protecting it from flooding as well. As things stand, we're due to start construction in May, so this is obviously a model and we've got some designs, but we're actually not on site yet. I submitted for planning earlier this week, and we're hoping that all being well, that's the weather primarily, and no more nasty surprises, hopefully we'll have this constructed by September of this year. Thank you very much.